Hello, my name is Tej van Pettinger from Economics Help, and today we're going to look at the pros and cons of labour shortages. The UK is experiencing quite a few acute labour shortages in certain industries such as lorry drivers, fruit pickers and meat packers. And partly this is a result of Brexit with a fall in the supply of cheap immigrant labour, which used to do these relatively low-skilled jobs, and now firms are struggling to fill in these vacancies. So it's a good example of free market economics in action. If you have a significant shortage and a fall in supply of labour, then classical economics shows how this leads to an increase in wages. And we are seeing this to some extent with rising wages of lorry drivers, meat packers, fruit pickers. And so some people are pointing out that this is a well-deserved wage rise for some of these workers who have been undervalued for quite a long time. And some supporters of Brexit will point to this as signs that this is a benefit because the low-paid are getting a wage rise. Now, this is true to some extent, but it is worth bearing in mind that a lot of these labour shortages have been ongoing for quite a while, and it's only now that they are very acute that wages are going up. And even though they've increased, I think the wage increases are still fairly moderate, above inflationary increases, but not exceptional. And despite the wage increases, firms are still struggling to attract enough workers to fill in the vacancies. And this is because supply is actually quite inelastic. And when you're at a position of close to full employment, then workers, they have a choice of jobs. And even though being a meat packer might be 5%, 10% higher wage, it's still unattractive. People don't want to take on the job. And farmers say a similar thing, that even though wages have been increased for picking fruit, many native UK workers don't want to do that. It's hard work, you get outside, you work to get cold, and when you can get a similar wage rate stacking shelves in Tesco, then farmers have struggled to fill in the vacancies. So on the one hand, we're seeing a rise in wages, but on the other hand, these labour shortages are causing real costs to the economy. Some farmers can't collect all their harvest. There's a shortage of goods being delivered by lorry. And so the consumer is seeing some empty shelves and the economic output is less than we otherwise would have had. So labour shortage is definitely not without problems. Now, another potential benefit of labour shortages is that it acts as a spur to productivity. Because if you can rely on cheap labour, there's less incentive to invest in new technology, new capital. But if farmers are thinking they're not going to be able to get enough workers, then it creates an incentive to try to automate the process. And there are at least potential machines that can pick certain types of fruit, and over the years these will probably get better. So it's not a short-term fix, but in the long term, a shortage of labour may really spur productivity gains, which can lead to higher economic growth in the long term. However, on the other hand, something else might happen. If firms can't get the necessary labour, they may shift production overseas to where it is. So that's another problem. Also, when we look at the supply and demand, that supposing the UK has had a fall in the supply of migrant workers, so the supply shifts to the left, pushes up wages. But also, we have to bear in mind that immigration isn't a one-way situation, because as workers leave, it's true their supply will fall, but also it will cause a fall in aggregate demand. If you get people leaving the economy who are earning money, then they will no longer be spending. So if you get a big fall in workers, then you will get less economic growth, and also lower tax revenues. It's worth bearing in mind that immigration into the UK, especially from Europe, which was mostly adults, was a net contributor to the UK budget. So, labour shortages, they are a sign that the market isn't working, and it does create incentives. And in theory, we should get rising wages, and this should return the market to equilibrium. But in the real world, this return to equilibrium might be quite slow because there's market imperfections. People don't necessarily want to do these jobs even at slightly higher pay. And there's also the markets are very competitive. So if you take lorry drivers, a lot of lorry companies say the reason they struggle to increase wages is because supermarkets have so much buying power. They squeeze their profit margins, and they're under pressure to both deliver the goods, but also to keep wages low. And the final point I want to make about this topic is that labour shortages are not the only way to increase wages. You shouldn't have to rely on acute labour shortages like the UK has to have a rise in wages. So for example, in the Netherlands, lorry drivers through collective bargaining have enabled higher wages across their industry, and not just relying on extreme labour shortages, which imposes costs on the economy and the consumer.